You watch colleagues with less talent rise to positions of power while your honest efforts go unrecognized and unrewarded. Every day you operate with transparency and good intentions, yet somehow others seem to effortlessly navigate office politics and social dynamics to get what they want, while you struggle to gain basic respect. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, and I spent my life studying how power truly works, not how we wish it worked, but how it actually operates in the shadows of human nature. For over 500 years, leaders have used my principles to shape outcomes without anyone realizing they were being guided. What I discovered about influence and control will transform how you navigate every relationship and situation in your life. The same strategies that shaped Renaissance politics can help you master modern dynamics without compromising your integrity. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for true understanding of power. I was born into a world where power wore many masks, and Florence taught me that the most dangerous ones were the most beautiful. My father, though of noble blood, possessed little wealth, and I learned early that in Renaissance Italy, gold spoke louder than genealogy. Yet this supposed disadvantage became my greatest teacher, for I was forced to observe the powerful from the shadows rather than join their glittering circles. The Medici sealed that simple ring, bearing the 6 red balls on a field of gold, opened more doors in Florence than any key ever forged. I watched as men twice my father's age bowed before Lorenzo de' Medici, not because he held official title, but because he held something far more valuable: the invisible threads that connected every merchant, every artist, every politician in our city. Lorenzo never needed to raise his voice or make threats. A word here, a suggestion there, and suddenly trade routes shifted, alliances formed, and rivals found themselves isolated. I remember the day I truly understood how power flowed through Florence like an underground river. I was perhaps 20 years old, serving as a junior clerk in the city government, when a dispute arose between 2 wealthy merchant families over water rights. The official hearing was theater elaborate arguments, citations of ancient law, passionate appeals to justice. Yet I noticed something peculiar. Both families' representatives kept glancing toward a balcony where Lorenzo stood, apparently absorbed in conversation with a visiting dignitary from Venice. That evening, long after the official proceedings had ended in stalemate, I watched Lorenzo's private secretary deliver 2 sealed letters. By morning, the dispute was resolved. No new laws were passed, no judges overruled, no officials contradicted. Simply 2 men who woke up understanding that their interests lay in cooperation rather than conflict. The official records would show a mutual agreement reached through negotiation. The truth was far more elegant. This was my first glimpse into what I would later call the hidden architecture of influence. Lorenzo had created a system where his desires became other people's ideas, where his interests aligned so naturally with others that they believed they were pursuing their own goals. He understood that the greatest power is exercised when no one realizes it is being exercised at all. I began to study this phenomenon obsessively. I watched how certain people could enter a room and subtly shift the entire dynamic without saying a word. I observed how some individuals could plant suggestions that bloomed into other people's convictions. I noticed how the most influential figures often appeared to be merely facilitating what everyone else wanted, while somehow everything that happened served their ultimate purpose. The Medici Bank was not just a financial institution. It was a web of relationships that spanned continents. Every loan created a connection. Every investment built a dependency. Every transaction strengthened the network. Lorenzo understood that money was simply a tool for creating human bonds that could be activated when needed. He made himself indispensable, not through force or fear, but by becoming the bridge that connected everyone else's ambitions. This realization shattered my naive understanding of how the world worked. I had believed that power flowed from titles, from official positions, from public declarations, but Florence taught me that true influence moved through invisible channels, personal relationships, shared interests, mutual dependencies, and carefully cultivated trust. The man who appeared to have the most power was often merely the public face of forces he neither controlled nor fully understood. As I rose through the ranks of Florentine government, I made it my business to map these hidden networks. I learned who owed favors to whom, which families held grudges spanning generations, whose children were being educated together, whose businesses depended on whose goodwill. This invisible architecture determined the fate of our city far more than any constitution or law ever could. My simple clerk's quill became the most powerful instrument in Florence, though no one suspected it. While diplomats and generals received the glory, I wielded influence through the modest act of taking notes. This humble quill taught me that the appearance of powerlessness is often power's most effective disguise. When I became second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, my official duties seemed mundane: correspondence, record-keeping, administrative details. Yet, from this seemingly subordinate position, I shaped the foreign policy of one of Italy's most influential city-states. I learned that people speak more freely around those they perceive as harmless, and they trust those who appear to serve rather than command. During negotiations with foreign ambassadors, I would sit quietly in the corner, apparently focused on transcribing the proceedings, but I was actually studying every gesture, every hesitation, every glance exchanged between the participants. When delegates took breaks, they would often approach me with casual questions about Florentine customs or previous agreements. They saw me as a helpful functionary, not realizing that I was gathering intelligence that would later influence my recommendations to the actual decision-makers. I discovered that my perceived insignificance was my greatest asset. Ambassadors, who would never reveal their true positions to the Gonfalonier, would casually mention their real constraints to the quiet scribe in the corner. They would discuss their private instructions, their fallback positions, their genuine concerns, all because they assumed I was merely a recording device rather than an active participant in the diplomatic process. The paradox became clear. The more openly someone pursues power, the more resistance they encounter. People instinctively distrust those who appear ambitious, but they embrace those who seem to facilitate others' success. I learned to guide conversations through carefully crafted questions rather than direct statements. Instead of arguing for a particular policy, I would ask, have we considered how this might affect our trade relationships with Venice? Or what would happen if word of this reached a French court? These innocent inquiries would plant seeds that bloomed into other people's insights. Within hours, the very concerns I had subtly introduced would be presented back to me as original thoughts by the official negotiators. They believed they were being brilliant strategists, never realizing they were following a path I had illuminated for them. I perfected the art of appearing to discover ideas rather than introducing them. When I wanted to propose a particular course of action, I would present it as a possibility I had just noticed in the documents, or as an interpretation that had occurred to me while reviewing the historical precedents. By framing my suggestions as observations rather than recommendations, I removed the natural resistance that people feel toward being told what to do. The quill became my symbol because it represented passive power, the ability to shape events through documentation, interpretation, and selective emphasis, rather than through commands or coercion. I could influence which precedents were cited, which concerns were highlighted, which options were presented to decision-makers. By controlling the information flow, I controlled the decisions that flowed from that information. This approach protected me from the dangers that befell more obvious. When policies succeeded, the officials received credit. When they failed, I was merely the scribe who had recorded their decisions. Yet over time, those same officials began to depend on my insights, my historical knowledge, my ability to anticipate consequences they had not considered. I became indispensable not by making myself the center of attention, but by making myself essential to others' success. The appearance of powerlessness created actual power, while the pursuit of obvious power often led to actual powerlessness. The bronze mirror in my study reflected more than faces it, revealed the duality that exists in every human soul. I kept it, not for vanity, but as a reminder that people always present two versions of themselves: the public persona they want the world to see, and the private reality that drives their true actions. Mastering influence required me to see beyond the surface reflection to the deeper truths beneath. In my years of observing Florence's elite, I discovered that human nature follows predictable patterns. Despite their claims of unique wisdom or noble purpose, people are driven by the same fundamental desires: the need for security, the hunger for recognition, and the pursuit of advantage over their competitors. Once you understand these core motivations, human behavior becomes remarkably transparent. I remember studying Cesare Borgia during his rise to power in the Papal States. Publicly, he proclaimed his mission to bring unity and justice to the Italian peninsula. His supporters praised his vision, his enemies feared his military prowess. But I saw something different in that bronze reflection of his character. Beneath the grand rhetoric and strategic brilliance, I recognized a man consumed by the need to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy, desperate to be seen as legitimate despite his bastard birth. This insight allowed me to predict his eventual downfall long before it occurred. Caesar's core insecurity made him impatient for recognition, leading him to overextend his conquests and alienate potential allies. He could not resist the temptation to display his power rather than consolidate it quietly. When his father died and political circumstances shifted, Caesar found himself isolated precisely because he had prioritized appearing powerful over building lasting relationships. The mirror taught me that people's greatest strengths and their fatal weaknesses often spring from the same source. Caesar's ruthless ambition enabled his rapid rise, but ensured his spectacular fall. Lorenzo de' Medici's talent for making everyone feel important to him created unshakable loyalty, but it also required him to make promises he could not always keep, eventually forcing him into increasingly complex political arrangements. I learned to read the unspoken language of human motivation by watching how people reacted to different types of pressure. Some individuals became more cooperative when they felt appreciated and included. Others responded better to subtle reminders of what they stood to lose. Some craved public recognition above all else. Others valued private acknowledgement from those they respected. Understanding these hidden drivers allowed me to approach each person in the way most likely to align their interests with my own. The most revealing moments came during crises, when the polished facades cracked and people's true priorities emerged. During the Pisan Revolt, I watched as Florence's nobility divided into predictable camps based not on philosophical differences about governance, but on personal calculations about which side would best protect their individual interests. Those who spoke most eloquently about justice and honor were often those who stood to gain the most from their chosen position. This observation led me to a crucial insight. People rarely act from pure principle, but they always act from perceived self-interest. The key to influence lies not in changing what people want, but in helping them see how what you want serves what they want. Instead of fighting against human nature, I learned to work with it, channeling natural motivations toward desired outcomes. The bronze mirror also reflected my own duality. While I genuinely believed in the importance of effective governance and Italian unity, I was not immune to the same drives that motivated others. My desire to be recognized as a serious political thinker influenced my decisions as much as my commitment to Florence's welfare. Acknowledging this self-awareness actually enhanced my effectiveness, because it prevented me from the self-deception that clouds the judgment of those who believe themselves above human nature. I discovered that the most successful influencers are those who understand their own motivations clearly enough to account for them, while recognizing that others are often blind to their own deeper drives. This asymmetry of self-knowledge becomes a powerful advantage in any relationship or in creation. The chess set in my private chamber taught me that influence requires mastering to distinct languages, the direct force of the lion and the subtle cunning of the fox. Each piece on the board moved according to different rules, just as different situations demanded different approaches to human psychology. Most people know only one language, usually that of the sheep, making them easy to guide for those who speak both. I developed this metaphor after observing how the most effective leaders could seamlessly shift between approaches. When dealing with the French king's ambassador, direct confrontation worked best. He respected strength and responded to clear demonstrations of power. But when handling the Venetian merchants, subtlety proved far more effective. They preferred to believe they had discovered profitable arrangements on their own rather than being pressured into agreements. My personal education in this duality came during a crucial negotiation with the Swiss mercenaries who were threatening to abandon Florence mid-campaign. The military commanders wanted to issue ultimatums and threats the language of the lion. I suggested a different approach. Instead of confronting their demands directly, I arranged for them to accidentally overhear conversations about alternative arrangements we were supposedly considering with German Landsknechts. Within days, the Swiss representatives approached us with a remarkably reasonable proposal that addressed all our concerns while allowing them to maintain their dignity. They believed they were being clever negotiators, not realizing they were responding to information we had deliberately placed in their path. The fox's tongue had achieved what the lion's roar would have made impossible. I learned that timing determines which language to speak. Early in any relationship, the fox's approach builds trust and reduces resistance. People need to feel comfortable before they will accept influence. But there are moments when only the lion's directness will suffice, when immediate action is required, when respect must be established, or when previous subtlety has been misinterpreted as weakness. The art lies in recognizing which approach each individual situation requires. Some people interpret courtesy as weakness and respond only to strength. Others view directness as aggression and shut down immediately. Reading these preferences correctly can mean the difference between successful influence and complete failure. During my diplomatic missions, I would often switch languages within the same conversation. I might begin with the foxes, thoughtful questions, expressing genuine interest in the other person's perspective, finding common ground. Once trust was established, I could occasionally employ the lion's directness to emphasize important points or establish boundaries. The contrast made the moments of strength more impactful, while the overall tone remained collaborative. The greatest masters of influence, I discovered, make these transitions so smoothly that others never realize they are being guided through a carefully orchestrated experience. They appear to be simply having a natural conversation, but every shift in tone and approach serves a strategic purpose. I also learned that most people default to one approach and use it regardless of its effectiveness in specific situations. The naturally aggressive types try to solve every problem with confrontation. The naturally diplomatic types avoid necessary confrontations until situations become critical. Both approaches have their place, but rigid adherence to either one severely limits your influence. The sheep, meanwhile, have no language of their own. They respond to whoever speaks most confidently, whether that confidence comes from the lion's strength or the fox's cleverness. They follow clear direction when it is provided firmly, and they embrace suggestions when they are presented subtly. Understanding this allows you to communicate with the vast majority of people in the way that will be most effective for each specific interaction. Mastering both languages also provides protection against those who would use these same techniques against you. When someone attempts to influence you through pure aggression, you can respond with strategic flexibility rather than reactive emotion. When someone tries to manipulate you through excessive charm, you can appreciate their skill while maintaining your own agenda. The chess set reminds me daily that influence is a game of multiple strategies, and victory goes to those who can adapt their approach to the demands of each unique situation rather than those who rely on a single, rigid method. The carnival mask hanging in my study symbolizes perhaps my most controversial insight, that the appearance of virtue often matters more than virtue itself in the theater of human relations. I learned this not from cynicism, but from observing how people actually judge leaders versus how they claim to judge them. The mask represents the performance that effective influence sometimes requires. During Florence's carnival celebrations, I watched how citizens behaved differently when their identities were concealed. The same merchants who preached honesty in the marketplace engaged in elaborate deceptions behind their masks. The same nobles who spoke of honor in public pursued petty vengeances in private. Yet these same people demanded perfect virtue from their leaders while practicing flexible morality in their own lives. This observation led me to a troubling realization. People judge leaders by outcomes, not by adherence to abstract principles. When Cesare Borgia used brutal methods to bring peace to the Romagné, the citizens celebrated the results rather than condemning the means. When other leaders employed gentler approaches that failed to achieve stability, those same citizens complained about weak leadership, regardless of moral superiority. I witnessed this dynamic personally during Florence's conflict with Pisa. Our previous leadership had attempted to resolve the situation through negotiation and compromise approaches that appeared virtuous but achieved nothing. The Pisans interpreted our restraint as weakness and became increasingly intransigent. Meanwhile, Florentine citizens grew frustrated with leaders who seemed more concerned with appearing righteous than with protecting Florentine interests. When circumstances forced us to employ harder tactics, public opinion shifted dramatically. The same actions that would have been condemned as excessive when applied initially were praised as decisive leadership when applied after diplomatic failures. I learned that context shapes moral judgment far more than people like to admit. The challenge becomes maintaining the perception of virtue while achieving practical results. This requires understanding what your audience actually values versus what they claim to value. Most people want leaders who appear to share their moral convictions while delivering outcomes that serve their interests. The successful leader learns to satisfy both demands simultaneously. I developed techniques for presenting necessary actions in ways that emphasized their virtuous aspects while minimizing moral concerns. When recommending military action, I would frame it as protecting innocent citizens rather than pursuing conquest. When suggesting political alliances with questionable partners, I would emphasize how these relationships served Florence's ability to maintain independence and republican values. The key insight is that virtue exists in the eye of the beholder, and different audiences value different virtues. The merchant class valued practical wisdom and effective results. The nobility valued honor and traditional forms. The common people valued justice and protection. By understanding these preferences, I could present the same policy in ways that appealed to each group's particular concept of virtue. I also learned that small, visible acts of conventional virtue could provide cover for larger, necessary actions. that might appear questionable. Public displays of piety, charity, or humility created a reservoir of goodwill that could be drawn upon when circumstances required less palatable decisions. The mask of virtue, worn consistently in small matters, made people more willing to trust your judgment in larger ones. This approach requires genuine skill and self-awareness. You must understand your own moral boundaries clearly enough to avoid losing yourself in the performance. The goal is not to become amoral, but to achieve moral outcomes through practical means, while maintaining the trust and support necessary for long-term effectiveness. I discovered that those who refuse to engage in this theater often find themselves unable to achieve even the virtuous outcomes they genuinely desire. Rigid moral purity can become a form of selfishness if it prioritizes personal righteousness over practical results that benefit others. The leader who will not compromise their pristine principles may leave their people vulnerable to those who have no principles at all. The carnival mask reminds me that leadership often requires playing a role, but the performance must serve a purpose beyond personal advancement. The appearance of virtue becomes genuinely virtuous when it enables you to protect and serve those who depend on your success. The ledger book on my desk tracked a currency more valuable than gold, the careful accounting of favors given and received. Throughout Florence's network of relationships, I discovered that while money could buy temporary cooperation, favors created lasting bonds that could be activated years later when circumstances changed. This invisible economy of obligations became the foundation of my influence. My education in this currency began when I noticed how certain individuals could accomplish seemingly impossible tasks with remarkable ease. They had no official authority, limited financial resources, yet doors opened for them throughout the city. I began to map their secret. They had systematically invested in other people's success, creating a network of goodwill that functioned like a bank account they could draw upon when needed. I started small, looking for opportunities to help others in ways that cost me little but provided them significant value. When a young merchant needed an introduction to a Venetian trading house, I arranged the meeting through my diplomatic contacts. When a nobleman's son required guidance navigating the city bureaucracy, I provided the necessary advice and introductions. Each favor was modest, but each created a bond of gratitude and obligation. The key insight was understanding that favors must feel genuinely helpful rather than calculating. People can sense when assistance comes with obvious strings attached, and such transparent manipulation often backfires. Instead, I learned to help others in ways that appeared to spring from natural generosity or professional courtesy, while privately noting the potential future value of each relationship. I developed a system for categorizing different types of favors based on their long-term strategic value. Information favors, sharing useful knowledge, or early warning screedet. Ongoing relationships because people would return for future insights. Access favors, providing introductions, or opening doors, established me as a valuable connector within the network. Problem-solving favors, helping resolve difficulties, or navigate obstacles, demonstrated my practical utility. The most powerful favors were those that helped others achieve their own goals rather than asking them to serve mine. When I learned that a particular guild leader was struggling to secure favorable terms with a supplier, I used my contacts to help him negotiate a better arrangement. Months later, when I needed support for a policy initiative, he became one of my strongest advocates without my having to ask directly. I also discovered the importance of timing in the favor economy. Offering help when someone is struggling creates deeper gratitude than providing assistance when they are already successful. People remember who supported them during difficult periods, and those memories translate into lasting loyalty when their circumstances improve. The ledger became essential. because the favor economy operates on delayed reciprocity, unlike monetary transactions that are completed immediately. Favors create ongoing relationships that may not be activated for months or years. Keeping track of who owed what to whom allowed me to understand the hidden dynamics that influenced decision-making throughout Florence. This network required careful maintenance. Favors must be collected thoughtfully, too aggressively, and you appear manipulative, too passively, and people forget their obligations. I learned to remind people of our connection through casual conversation rather than direct requests. A simple "I hope that introduction to the Venetian trader worked out well for you" would refresh their memory of my assistance while opening the door for future cooperation. The beauty of this system was its self-reinforcing nature. As my reputation for helpful connections grew, more people sought my assistance, expanding my network and increasing my value to everyone within it. I became known as someone who could solve problems and open doors, which attracted exactly the kind of relationships that enhanced my ability to solve problems and open doors. I also learned to diversify my favor portfolio across different social levels and interest groups, helping both merchants and nobles, both religious leaders and secular officials, both allies and potential opponents, created a robust network that could function even when political winds shifted. This broad foundation protected me from the dangers of depending too heavily on any single relationship or faction. The ledger reminds me that true wealth lies not in what you own, but in who owes you favors and who you can call upon when circumstances require assistance that cannot be purchased with gold. The hourglass on my mantle taught me that timing transforms the same action from brilliance to folly, from persuasion to resistance. I learned to think like a serpent, patient, observant, striking only when conditions guaranteed success. Most people fail at influence not because they lack good ideas, but because they present those ideas at precisely the wrong moment. My education in timing came through watching political initiatives succeed and fail based not on their merit, but on when they were introduced. During one memorable session of the City Council, I observed 3 separate proposals for trade reform. The first was dismissed without discussion because it came during budget debates when everyone was focused on expenses. The second was rejected because it was presented while tensions with Venice were high and any change seemed risky. The third, virtually identical to the first 2, was embraced enthusiastically because it arrived just after news of a competitor city's successful trade expansion. This experience taught me that people's receptiveness to ideas follows predictable cycles. During periods of crisis, they want stability and proven solutions. During peaceful times, they become more open to innovation and change. After failures, they seek someone to blame and become resistant to proposals from anyone associated with previous decisions. After successes, they feel confident and willing to take calculated risks. I began to map these emotional rhythms throughout Florence's political establishment. I learned to recognize when influential individuals were feeling secure enough to consider new approaches versus when they were feeling threatened and defensive. I discovered that the same person who would reject an idea completely on Tuesday might embrace it enthusiastically on Thursday if circumstances had shifted their emotional state. The serpent became my symbol for this patience, because serpents never strike until they are certain of success. They wait motionless for hours, observing their prey, calculating the perfect moment when conditions align for a swift, decisive action. Premature striking leads to missed opportunities and exposed positions. Perfect timing turns even modest abilities into devastating effectiveness. I developed a personal practice of seeding ideas months before I intended to propose them formally. During casual conversations, I would mention concepts as possibilities worth considering someday. I would reference examples from other cities or historical precedents that might prove relevant to future decisions. By the time I made actual proposals, the groundwork was already prepared and the ideas felt familiar rather than foreign. The hourglass also taught me about the rhythm of individual conversations. People need time to process new information and reconcile it with their existing beliefs. Pushing too hard or too fast creates resistance, while allowing natural pauses gives them space to convince themselves. I learned to present key points early in discussions, then shift to related topics while the central ideas settled into their thinking. I discovered that seasonal timing matters as much as situational timing. Florentines were more receptive to ambitious projects in spring when optimism ran high, more focused on practical concerns during harvest season when immediate results mattered most, more conservative during winter when resources felt scarce. Understanding these cycles allowed me to match my proposals to periods when they would receive the most favorable consideration. The most sophisticated timing involved orchestrating multiple factors simultaneously. I once spent 18 months preparing for a crucial policy change by gradually shifting key supporters into favorable positions, waiting for a particular opponent to become distracted by personal concerns, and timing the formal proposal to coincide with news that made our approach appear prescient rather than radical. This experience taught me that great influence often looks effortless, because all the preparation remains invisible. Like the serpent's strike, the visible action represents only a tiny fraction of the total investment. The careful observation, patient positioning, and precise timing that enable success happen in silence and shadow. I also learned that timing creates its own opportunities. By becoming known for my patience and careful judgment, I attracted confidences from people who wanted to share their plans and concerns with someone who would not act precipitously. This intelligence gathering enhanced my ability to time future initiatives perfectly. The hourglass reminds me that time is the ultimate weapon of influence. Those who master timing can achieve with patience what others cannot accomplish through force, persuasion, or brilliance. In the economy of human relationships, perfect timing is worth more than perfect execution. The map of Italian city-states covering my office wall revealed more than territorial boundaries. It showed the invisible landscape of relationships that determined the fate of nations. Each border represented not just political control, but the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and dependencies that shifted like underground currents beneath the surface of formal diplomacy. I learned that understanding this hidden geography was essential for navigating any environment where multiple interests competed. Florence sat at the center of this intricate network, surrounded by powers that could be allies, enemies, or both, depending on circumstances. Venice controlled the eastern trade routes, but feared French expansion. Milan dominated the north, but worried about Austrian intervention. Rome held spiritual authority, but lacked military strength. Naples commanded the south, but depended on foreign support. Each relationship with one power affected relationships with all others. My breakthrough came when I realized that this same principle applied to every human environment, from the grandest political arena to the smallest office gathering. Every person exists within a network of relationships that influence their decisions, constrain their options, and determine whose opinions they value. Understanding these networks allows you to predict behavior, identify opportunities, and position yourself strategically within the web of influence. I began mapping the hidden connections within Florence's government, much as I mapped international alliances. I discovered that certain officials who appeared to be rivals were actually bound by family marriages that prevented them from opposing each other directly. I learned that others who seemed friendly in public meetings harbored deep grudges over past slights that colored their judgment on seemingly unrelated matters. I identified individuals who served as bridges between different factions, making them crucial to any initiative requiring broad support. The most valuable insight was recognizing that people's loyalties often had less to do with ideology than with personal relationships and mutual dependencies. A merchant might support a particular policy not because he believed in its wisdom, but because his daughter was engaged to marry the nephew of its primary advocate. A nobleman might oppose reforms not from philosophical conviction, but because his debts to certain creditors would be affected by the proposed changes. This understanding transformed my approach to building support for initiatives. Instead of trying to convince each person individually, I learned to identify the key relationship nodes whose influence would cascade through the network. Winning over 3 strategically chosen allies could be worth more than persuading dozens of isolated supporters, because those allies would bring their own networks along with them. I developed techniques for strengthening favorable connections while neutralizing problematic ones. When I identified natural allies who had never met, I would arrange social occasions that brought them together. When I discovered potential opponents who might join forces against common interests, I would look for ways to create competing priorities that kept them focused on each other rather than on my initiatives. The geography of alliances also taught me the importance of maintaining relationships with apparent enemies. Today's opponent might become tomorrow's essential partner when circumstances shifted. I made it a practice to avoid burning bridges unnecessarily, even when conflicts seemed irreconcilable. By leaving doors open for future reconciliation, I created options that proved valuable when political winds changed direction. I learned to think several moves ahead, like a chess master who sees how current positioning will affect future possibilities. When evaluating potential alliances, I considered not just immediate benefits, but how each relationship would influence my standing with other important players. Sometimes the wisest choice was declining an attractive partnership because it would create larger problems. Elsewhere in the network, the map also revealed the danger of becoming too dependent on any single relationship or faction. Political circumstances change rapidly, and those who tie their fortunes too closely to one group often find themselves isolated when power shifts. I maintained diverse connections across multiple networks, ensuring that I would retain influence regardless of which faction gained ascendancy. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that being perceived as a valuable connector enhanced my own position within every network. By facilitating relationships between others, providing information that helped them make better decisions, and serving as a trusted intermediary in sensitive negotiations, I made myself indispensable to the system itself rather than to any particular group within it. The shifting alliances of Italian politics taught me that the geography of relationships is never static. New connections form constantly while old ones dissolve. Successful navigation requires continuous observation, careful positioning, and the flexibility to adapt when the landscape changes around you. The sealed letter on my desk contained information that could topple governments, yet its power lay not in revealing its contents, but in keeping them hidden. I learned that secrets are the ultimate currency of influence, more valuable than gold, more powerful than armies, more persuasive than the finest rhetoric. The person who knows what others desperately want concealed holds a key that opens every door. My education in this delicate art began accidentally during my early diplomatic work. While organizing correspondence files, I discovered a misfiled letter revealing that one of Florence's most respected citizens was secretly negotiating to sell strategic information to Venice. Rather than immediately reporting this betrayal, I chose to study the situation more carefully. I wanted to understand not just what was happening, but why it was happening and who else might be involved. This patience proved invaluable. Over the following weeks, I learned that the man was being blackmailed over gambling debts that would have ruined his family's reputation. The Venetians were exploiting his desperation rather than purchasing his loyalty. Armed with this deeper understanding, I was able to approach him privately and offer a solution that served Florence's interests while protecting his reputation. He became one of my most reliable sources of intelligence about Venetian activities. This experience taught me that secrets give you power, not because you can expose them, but because you can protect them. People will do almost anything for someone who holds damaging information about them but chooses not to use it destructively. The restraint demonstrates both power and wisdom, creating a debt of gratitude that often proves more valuable than any immediate advantage. I developed techniques for encouraging people to share their hidden concerns and private plans. The key was creating an atmosphere of confidentiality and understanding rather than judgment. People desperately want to share their burdens with someone they trust, but they need assurance that their confidences will be protected. By establishing a reputation for discretion, I attracted secrets like honey attracts bees. The art lies in asking the right questions at the right moments. Instead of probing directly for sensitive information, I would express sympathy for the pressures people faced and admiration for how they handled difficult situations. This approach invited them to explain their challenges in detail, often revealing far more than they intended. A simple comment, like "I imagine the recent trade disruptions have created some difficult choices for merchants in your position," could unlock a flood of strategic information. I learned that timing was crucial for these conversations. People are most likely to reveal secrets when they are feeling overwhelmed, uncertain, or in need of advice. After difficult meetings, during social occasions when wine loosened tongues, or when they had just received troubling news, these were moments when careful listening could yield extraordinary insights. The sealed letter became my symbol because it represented the discipline required to use secret information wisely. The temptation to demonstrate your knowledge by hinting at what you know can be overwhelming, but the moment you reveal the source of your insight, you lose both the information advantage and the trust that made it possible. Secrets must be protected. Absolutely. Even from those closest to you. I discovered that holding secrets also means accepting responsibility for their consequences. When you know about hidden debts, secret alliances, or private weaknesses, you become complicit in the outcomes that flow from that knowledge. This burden requires careful moral consideration. Your silence can enable both beneficial and harmful actions by VARs. The most sophisticated practitioners understand that secrets create networks of mutual vulnerability. When multiple people have shared their hidden concerns with you, they become invested in your continued success and discretion. You hold pieces of information that, if revealed, could damage many relationships simultaneously. This creates a web of protection around your own position that is far more secure than any formal guarantee. I also learned that some secrets are too dangerous to hold. Information that could trigger wars, destroy innocent lives, or fundamentally destabilize the systems you depend on should be carefully considered before accepting. Sometimes the wisest choice is claiming ignorance and encouraging others to find different solutions to their problems. The sealed letter reminds me that in a world where everyone has something to hide, the person who can be trusted with those hidden truths wields influence that cannot be achieved through any other means. The key ring in my possession opened many doors, but its true power lay in the fact that others needed me to unlock them. I discovered that making yourself indispensable creates a form of influence more reliable than fear and more lasting than affection. When people depend on you for things they cannot easily obtain elsewhere, they become invested in your success and protective of your position. My understanding of dependency began when I noticed how certain individuals maintained influence far beyond what their official titles suggested they deserved. These were not the most powerful people in traditional terms, but they had positioned themselves as essential bridges between different groups that needed each other but could not communicate directly. They became indispensable by making themselves the solution to problems that others could not solve independently. I started identifying opportunities to create this type of dependency around my own position. During negotiations between Florence and other Italian states, I began maintaining detailed records not just of official agreements, but of the informal understandings, personal relationships, and unspoken compromises that made those agreements work in practice. Soon, diplomats from multiple cities were consulting me when they needed to understand the real meaning behind formal documents. The key was providing value that others found difficult to replicate. Anyone could take meeting notes, but only someone with my particular combination of historical knowledge, personal relationships, and understanding of each party's true motivations could interpret those notes in ways that prevented future misunderstandings. I became the institutional memory that all parties relied upon. I learned to position myself at critical junctions where important flows of information, resources, or access had to pass through my hands. When the Florentine government needed to communicate with mercenary captains, I became the preferred intermediary because I understood both military thinking and political necessity. When merchants needed government permits, they sought my guidance because I knew which officials handled which approvals and how to present requests in acceptable formats. This positioning required careful cultivation over time. I could not simply declare myself indispensably, had to demonstrate unique value repeatedly until others began to depend on my services naturally. Each successful intervention created precedent for future requests. Each problem I solved established my expertise in that particular area. Each relationship I facilitated added to my reputation as someone who could make difficult things happen. The art of dependency creation lies in understanding what people need but cannot easily obtain for themselves. Sometimes this meant access to influential individuals. Sometimes it meant interpretation of complex regulations. Sometimes it meant neutral mediation between parties who distrusted each other but needed to cooperate. By becoming the reliable solution to recurring problems, I made myself essential to the smooth functioning of systems that others depended upon. I discovered that the most powerful dependencies are those that people do not initially realize they have developed. When my services became part of their routine decision-making process, they stopped looking for alternatives. When my insights became integrated into their planning, they could not easily imagine proceeding without them. This gradual integration created bonds stronger than formal contracts, because breaking them would disrupt their entire operational framework. The key ring symbolized this because keys represent controlled access. I did not own the rooms, but I controlled who could enter them and when. I did not possess ultimate authority, but I managed the pathways through which authority had to flow. This type of power is more subtle than direct control, but often more durable because it operates below the level of conscious resistance. I also learned that dependency must be carefully balanced. Too little dependence, and people can easily replace you. Too much dependence, and they begin to resent your influence and look for ways to eliminate it. The optimal level makes you valuable enough to be protected, but not so powerful that you become threatening. People should feel grateful for your assistance, not trapped by your control. This approach required developing genuine expertise rather than simply positioning myself strategically. Sustainable dependency must be based on real value creation, not artificial scarcity. I invested heavily in understanding the complexities of governance, diplomacy, and human psychology so that my insights would be worth seeking regardless of my formal position. The dance metaphor became important because dependency relationships require constant adjustment and mutual accommodation. As circumstances change, People's needs evolve, and successful practitioners must adapt their services accordingly. What made you indispensable last year may become irrelevant next year unless you continue developing new forms of value. I learned to diversify my dependencies across multiple individuals and institutions so that no single relationship became critical to my overall position. This protected me from changes in fortune that might affect any particular ally while ensuring that I maintained essential relationships throughout the podded system. The key ring reminds me that true security comes not from what you own, but from what others need you to provide. When your success becomes intertwined with their success, your influence becomes as durable as their continued prosperity. The compass on my desk always pointed north, yet those who followed it believed they were choosing their own direction. I learned that the most powerful influence occurs when people feel completely free while being guided toward predetermined destinations. The art lies in presenting options that all serve your purpose while allowing others to believe they are. Making independent decisions. My mastery of this technique developed during negotiations, where direct persuasion had failed repeatedly. I was trying to convince the Florentine Council to support a particular military alliance, but every direct argument met with resistance. Some members feared the financial cost, others worried about antagonizing neutral parties, and still others simply opposed any initiative that came from my office. Traditional persuasion was creating more opposition than support. I changed tactics completely. Instead of advocating for my preferred alliance, I presented the council with 3 different strategic options, each carefully crafted to appeal to different constituencies, while ultimately leading to the same practical outcome. The first option emphasized economic benefits and appealed to the merchant faction. The second highlighted security advantages and attracted the military-minded members. The third stressed diplomatic flexibility and won over those concerned about international relationships. What appeared to be 3 distinct choices were actually 3 paths to the same destination. Regardless of which option the council selected, Florence would end up allied with the same powers, committed to the same basic strategy, and positioned according to my original plan. Yet because the council members felt they had debated the alternatives thoroughly and made their own choice, they supported the final decision with enthusiasm rather than reluctance. The compass became my symbol for this approach because it represents guidance that appears to be neutral. A compass does not force you to travel north, simply shows you where north lies and allows you to choose your own direction. Yet by providing that information, it influences your decisions in predictable ways. The skilled influencer learns to serve as a human compass, providing frameworks that guide others toward desired outcomes while preserving their sense of autonomy. I discovered that people resist being told what to do, but they embrace arriving at conclusions that feel like their own insights. The key is structuring the decision-making process so that the path of least resistance leads naturally to your preferred outcome. This requires understanding how people think, what they value, and what factors they consider when making choices. The technique works because it respects human psychology rather than fighting against it. People need to feel that their decisions reflect their own judgment and serve their own interests. When you can align your goals with their natural decision-making process, you eliminate the resistance that comes from feeling manipulated or pressured. I learned to frame choices in ways that made one option clearly superior without appearing to advocate for it directly. This might involve presenting information in a particular sequence, asking questions that led to obvious conclusions, or structuring comparisons that highlighted the advantages of the preferred alternative. The art lies in making the guidance feel like objective analysis rather than subjective persuasion. During diplomatic negotiations, I would often present counterparts with 3 potential agreements, one that was clearly unacceptable to them, one that was barely acceptable, and one that was quite favorable while still serving our essential interests. Predictably, they would reject the first, reluctantly consider the second, and enthusiastically embrace the third. They felt they had negotiated successfully, never realizing that even the most favorable option had been designed to serve our strategic purposes. The most sophisticated application involves shaping the menu of choices available rather than trying to influence which item people select from an existing menu. By controlling what options are presented, how they are described, and what information accompanies each alternative, you can guide decisions without ever appearing to constrain freedom. This approach requires deep understanding of the people you are influencing. You must know what they value, what they fear, how they make decisions, and what outcomes would genuinely serve their interests. The choices you present must be real alternatives that they would authentically prefer. The manipulation lies in ensuring that their authentic preferences align with your objectives. I also learned that timing affects how choices are perceived. The same set of options can appear generous or limiting depending on when they are presented and what context surrounds them. People who feel rushed often default to familiar choices, while those who feel they have adequate time for consideration become more adventurous in their selection. The compass reminds me that true influence provides direction without coercion, guidance without control, and structure without confinement. When people arrive at your desired destination believing they chose the route themselves, they become advocates for the decision rather than reluctant participants in your plan. The simple wooden cross on my wall reminded me daily that the appearance of selfless service often achieves more than the pursuit of obvious self-interest. I learned that humility, whether genuine or performed, disarms suspicion, creates trust, and opens doors that remain closed to those who appear ambitious. The greatest influence often comes disguised as the absence of personal agenda. This insight emerged from observing how different approaches to similar goals produced dramatically different results. When ambitious nobles openly sought greater power, they triggered immediate resistance from competitors who recognized the threat. But when others pursued the same objectives, while appearing to serve higher purposes, the good of the city, the welfare of the people, the glory of God, they often succeeded with minimal opposition. I began experimenting with presenting my own initiatives as responses to others' needs, rather than as fulfillment of my personal vision. Instead of proposing policies that would enhance my position, I would identify problems that concerned influential citizens and develop solutions that happened to require my particular skills. Instead of seeking recognition for my insights, I would present them as obvious conclusions that anyone might have reached. The wooden cross symbolized this approach, because religious service represented the ultimate model of influential humility. Priests and monks wielded enormous power throughout Italian society, not despite their claims of selflessness, but because of them. People trusted those who appeared to have surrendered personal ambition in service of higher purposes. This trust translated into influence that secular leaders could only dream of achieving. I learned to frame my own ambitions in terms of service to Florence's welfare. When I recommended military reforms, I emphasized how they would protect citizens, rather than how they would demonstrate my strategic wisdom. When I suggested diplomatic initiatives, I focused on their benefits for trade and security, rather than the expertise they would showcase. This approach made people feel they were supporting important causes, rather than advancing my career. The technique requires genuine understanding of what others value and authentic commitment to achieving outcomes that serve their interests alongside your own. Pure manipulation eventually becomes visible and backfires, but sincere service that also advances your position creates sustainable influence. The art lies in finding genuine alignment between your goals and others' needs. I discovered that humility, creates a psychological dynamic where people want to elevate those who do not seek elevation. When someone appears uninterested in personal glory, others often feel compelled to give them credit and recognition. When someone seems focused solely on the work itself, others become invested in ensuring that person receives appropriate rewards. During council debates, I learned to present my ideas tentatively, as possibilities worth exploring rather than conclusions I had reached independently. Phrases like "perhaps we might consider ... or "it occurs to me that ... made others feel they were participating in discovery rather than receiving instruction. This collaborative tone encouraged people to build upon my suggestions and ultimately claim ownership of the final decisions. The mask metaphor became important, because humility often requires performing a role rather than simply expressing natural personality. Most people who achieve positions of influence possess strong egos and ambitious drives. Learning to present yourself as modest and service-oriented, while maintaining the confidence necessary for leadership, requires careful balance and considerable skill. I found that small gestures of humility could create disproportionate goodwill, deflecting credit for successful outcomes, acknowledging the contributions of others, seeking advice from people whose opinions were valued. These behaviors cost little but generated significant trust and affection. People remembered being treated with respect by someone who could have demanded deference. The cross also reminded me that apparent powerlessness can be a source of actual power. When people believe you have no personal agenda, they share information more freely, include you in sensitive discussions, and trust you with responsibilities they would never give to obvious competitors. The perception of neutrality creates access that partisanship would destroy. I learned to present myself as a servant of institutional interests rather than as an independent actor. This positioning made me valuable to multiple factions because each group could work with me without feeling they were empowering a rival. My apparent lack of personal ambition made me safe to trust, while my obvious competence made me useful to employ. The wooden cross reminds me that in a world where everyone suspects everyone else of ulterior motives, the person who appears to have none possesses the ultimate strategic advantage. Humility opens doors that arrogance keeps locked, creates trust that self-promotion destroys, and builds influence that outlasts the careers of more obviously ambitious competitors. The wax seal bearing my family crest became my signature on documents that would outlive me, but its true power lay in the reputation it represented. I learned that reputation functions like compound interests. More consistent actions accumulate over time into enormous advantages that open doors, create opportunities, and generate trust that cannot be purchased or demanded. Your reputation precedes you into every room and remains after you leave. Building my reputation required understanding that every action contributes to a larger narrative about who you are and what you represent. Early in my career, I made decisions based primarily on immediate outcomes. I would choose whatever approach seemed most likely to succeed in the short term, without considering how those choices affected others' perception of my character and capabilities. This short-sighted thinking cost me dearly when I needed broader support for larger initiatives. People who had observed my pragmatic flexibility began to question whether I could be trusted with long-term commitments. They wondered if I would abandon partnerships when circumstances changed, or if I would honor agreements that no longer served my immediate interests. My reputation for cleverness was undermining my reputation for reliability. I began deliberately investing in my long-term reputation, even when it cost me short-term advantages. When allies faced difficulties, I continued supporting them publicly, even when distancing myself would have been politically safer. When opponents made reasonable points, I acknowledged their validity even when stubborn resistance might have been more advantageous. When mistakes occurred, I accepted responsibility even when blaming others would have been easier. These choices felt costly initially, but they generated dividends that multiplied over years. People began describing me as someone whose word could be trusted, whose loyalty was dependable, whose judgment was sound. This reputation created access to information and opportunities that would have been impossible to obtain through manipulation or force. Others sought my advice, included me in sensitive discussions, and recommended me for positions of greater responsibility. The wax seal became my symbol, because it represented the authentication that reputation provides. When my seal appeared on a document, people knew they could trust its contents without independent verification. When my name was associated with a proposal, they could assume it had been carefully considered and honestly presented. This credibility eliminated the resistance and skepticism that others faced when introducing new ideas. I discovered that reputation creates momentum that makes subsequent influence much easier. When people expect you to be insightful, they listen more carefully to your observations. When they expect you to be honest, they trust your information without extensive corroboration. When they expect you to be competent, they give you credit for results that might be attributed to luck if they came from someone with a different reputation. The compound interest effect means that reputation becomes more valuable over time, but it also becomes more fragile. A lifetime of careful construction can be destroyed by a single serious betrayal of trust. I learned to think of reputation as both an asset and a responsibility, something that required constant protection and careful stewardship. I developed specific practices for reputation management that became second nature over time. I made sure my private behavior aligned with my public persona, understanding that contradictions eventually become visible in small ways that undermine credibility. I honored commitments even when circumstances made them inconvenient, knowing that reliability today creates trust that can be drawn upon tomorrow. When conflicts arose, I looked for solutions that enhanced rather than damaged my reputation for fairness and wisdom. Sometimes this meant accepting compromises that gave me less than I might have demanded, but the long-term benefits of being seen as reasonable usually exceeded the short-term costs of moderation. I also learned to leverage others' reputations strategically. Associating with individuals known for integrity enhanced my own credibility. Supporting causes that aligned with my values reinforced the narrative about my character. Avoiding relationships with those whose reputations might contaminate mine protected the investment I had made in building trust. The most sophisticated aspect of reputation management involves understanding how different audiences perceive the same actions differently. What appears principled to one group might seem stubborn to another. What looks like wise caution to some might appear as indecisiveness to others. Successful reputation building requires considering how your choices will be interpreted by all the communities whose opinion matters to your long-term success. I discovered that reputation eventually becomes self-reinforcing. When enough people believe you possess certain qualities, their behavior toward you changes in ways that make those qualities more likely to emerge. When people expect wisdom from you, they ask better questions that help you provide wiser answers. When they expect honesty, they share information that helps you be more honest in return. The wax seal reminds me that reputation is the most durable form of power because it exists independently in other people's minds, long after specific achievements are forgotten. The general impression of your character influences how others interpret new information about you and determines whether they want to help or hinder your future endeavors. The business card in my hand bears modern symbols, yet the principles it represents remain unchanged since my time in Renaissance Florence. Today's workplace has transformed the battlefield from city-states to corporate corridors, from diplomatic negotiations to team meetings, from military alliances to professional networks. But human nature persists. and the fundamental dynamics of influence operate according to the same laws that governed power 5 centuries ago. Consider the modern conference room, where executives gather to make decisions that affect thousands of employees and millions in revenue. The official agenda lists items for discussion, but the real negotiations happen in the subtle exchanges of glance and gesture, in the strategic timing of comments, in the careful positioning of ideas to appear collaborative rather than competitive. The person who understands these hidden dynamics wields far more influence than their formal title suggests. I observe how the most successful contemporary leaders apply my principles without conscious awareness of their historical origins. They build networks of mutual obligation through strategic favors. They time their proposals to coincide with moments of maximum receptiveness. They present their ideas as solutions to problems that others have identified. They create dependencies by positioning themselves as essential bridges between different groups or resources. The technologies have evolved, but the psychology remains constant. Social media amplifies reputation effects that once required decades to develop. Now, a single post can enhance or destroy carefully built credibility within hours. Email creates permanent records of promises and commitments that function like the sealed letters of my era. Video conferences reveal the same non-verbal communications that I learned to read in face-to-face negotiations. Modern professionals who master influence understand that their LinkedIn profiles serve the same function as the formal presentations I made to foreign ambassadors. They create first impressions that determine how subsequent interactions unfold. They know that their responses to crisis situations become part of their reputation portfolio, just as my handling of diplomatic emergencies enhanced my standing with Florentine leadership. The art of appearing powerless translates directly to contemporary environments. The team member who asks thoughtful questions rather than making direct demands often guides group decisions more effectively than those who attempt to dominate discussions. The manager who presents options rather than orders creates buy-in that leads to better execution. The consultant who helps clients discover solutions earns more trust than those who impose recommendations. In today's knowledge economy, information serves the same function that secrets served in Renaissance politics. The person who understands industry trends, regulatory changes, competitive dynamics, and internal organizational politics possesses advantages that cannot be matched through formal authority alone. They become the source others consult when they need context for making important decisions. Contemporary alliance building happens through professional associations, alumni networks, industry conferences, and social connections that span organizational boundaries. The most influential modern professionals cultivate relationships across multiple networks, ensuring that they maintain access to opportunities, regardless of changes in their immediate work environment. The dependency principles apply directly to modern career development. Professionals who make themselves indispensable by developing unique combinations of skills, maintaining critical relationships, or serving as bridges between different functional areas, create security that transcends any particular job or company. They become too valuable to lose and too connected to ignore. Modern timing considerations include understanding organizational rhythms, budget cycles, leadership transitions, and market conditions that affect receptiveness to new ideas. The same proposal that fails during a period of financial stress might succeed brilliantly when introduced during a growth phase. The executive who masters these rhythms can achieve dramatic results with modest efforts. The illusion of choice operates powerfully in contemporary decision-making processes. The person who controls the agenda, frames the alternatives, and structures the evaluation criteria often determines outcomes more effectively than those who argue for specific positions. Modern influence flows to those who design the decision-making process rather than those who participate in it most vocally. Virtual communication has created new opportunities for the strategic positioning I perfected in Florence. The person who controls meeting agendas, manages information distribution, and facilitates connections between others often wields more influence than formal leaders. Technology amplifies the advantages that come from understanding human psychology and organizational dynamics. The modern prince's toolkit includes traditional skills, reading people, building relationships, timing interventions, creating value for others, enhanced by contemporary tools that accelerate and amplify these ancient principles. Success still belongs to those who understand that influence flows through invisible channels, that perception shapes reality, and that the appearance of powerlessness often contains the seeds of actual power. The business card reminds me that, while the surface manifestations of power continue evolving, the underlying principles remain as relevant today as they were when I walked the halls of the Palazzo Vecchio. The person who masters these timeless dynamics while adapting to contemporary contexts inherits advantages that no amount of technical skill or formal education can provide. The balance scale on my desk weighs not gold against silver, but effectiveness against morality, the eternal tension that defines the responsible use of influence. I have been accused of advocating amorality, yet my true teaching concerns the relationship between good intentions and practical results. The person who understands influence but refuses to use it often enables greater harm than those who use it wisely for beneficial ends. My reputation for cynicism stems from my refusal to pretend that virtuous intentions alone produce virtuous outcomes. I observed too many well-meaning leaders whose moral purity led to disasters that harmed the very people they sought to protect. I watched principled negotiators whose unwillingness to engage in strategic thinking resulted in agreements that benefited their opponents at their own people's expense. I witnessed idealistic reformers whose naive approach to human nature enabled corrupt individuals to exploit their blind spots. The balance scale reminds me that every use of influence carries moral weight, but so does every failure to use influence when it could prevent suffering or create beneficial outcomes. The leader who refuses to engage in office politics may preserve their personal integrity while allowing incompetent or malicious individuals to gain power over others. The negotiator who will not employ strategic psychology may lose deals that would have created jobs and prosperity for their community. I learned to distinguish between influence that serves broader interests and manipulation that serves only narrow self-interest. When I helped Florence navigate the treacherous waters of Italian politics, my techniques served the welfare of hundreds of thousands of citizens who depended on our city's independence and prosperity. When I guided negotiations that prevented wars, the strategic psychology I employed saved lives and protected communities from destruction. The key ethical principle is alignment between your use of influence and outcomes that benefit others beyond yourself. The techniques I teach become moral when they serve purposes larger than personal advancement. They become immoral when they exploit others' vulnerabilities for purely selfish gain. The difference lies not in the methods employed, but in the intentions that guide them and the results they produce. I also discovered that understanding influence provides crucial protection against those who would use it against you unethically. The person who remains naive about how persuasion works becomes vulnerable to manipulation by less scrupulous individuals. Knowledge of these dynamics allows you to recognize when others are attempting to exploit your psychology and gives you tools to resist unwanted influence. The balance scale weighs immediate costs against long-term benefits. Sometimes ethical influence requires accepting short-term moral discomfort to achieve outcomes that serve the greater good. When I negotiated with mercenary captains who had committed atrocities, I felt moral revulsion at treating them as legitimate partners. Yet those negotiations prevented sieges that would have killed innocent civilians and destroyed communities that had no role in the conflicts. This does not mean that any end justifies any means, but rather that moral evaluation must consider the full context of available alternatives and likely consequences. The leader who refuses to compromise with imperfect allies may find themselves unable to prevent much worse outcomes orchestrated by those who have no moral constraints whatsoever. I learned to establish personal boundaries that prevented the use of influence from corrupting my fundamental values. I would employ strategic psychology to achieve beneficial outcomes, but I would not betray genuine allies or harm innocent people, regardless of the advantages such actions might provide. These lines protected my character while allowing me to remain effective in an imperfect world. The ethics of influence also require accepting responsibility for the consequences of your actions. When you guide others' decisions through strategic presentation of choices, you become partially accountable for the outcomes that result. This responsibility demands careful consideration of likely results and genuine commitment to others' welfare alongside your own interests. I discovered that transparency about your motivations often enhances rather than undermines ethical influence. When people understand that you have interests at stake but also genuinely care about their welfare, they make better decisions about whether to trust your guidance. Pretending to have no personal agenda is often less ethical than acknowledging your interests while demonstrating your commitment to mutually beneficial outcomes. The most sophisticated ethical framework recognizes that influence is inevitable in human relationships. The only choice is whether it will be conscious and responsible, or unconscious and potentially harmful. Every interaction shapes others' perceptions and decisions to some degree. Those who understand this dynamic can use it thoughtfully, while those who deny it often influence others accidentally in ways they never intended. The balanced scale reminds me that moral leadership requires both good intentions and effective methods. The person who possesses only good intentions without understanding how to implement them often fails to achieve beneficial outcomes. The person who possesses only effective methods without good intentions may achieve success while causing unnecessary harm. The combination of ethical purpose and sophisticated understanding of human nature creates the possibility for influence that serves both personal interests and the common good. The weight of responsibility that comes with this knowledge is substantial, but so is the opportunity to create positive change in a world where power often flows to those who understand it least or care about its consequences not at all. The teaching scroll unfurled before me bears the wisdom I wish someone had shared when I began my own journey through the labyrinth of human influence. Now, as I prepare to pass these insights forward, I recognize that understanding these principles is only the beginning. Mastery comes through careful practice, thoughtful observation, and gradual application of techniques that must be adapted to your unique circumstances and moral framework. Begin with observation rather than action. Before attempting to influence others, study how influence already flows through your environment. Notice who others turn to for advice, whose opinions carry weight in group discussions, which relationships seem to open doors and create opportunities. Map the invisible networks of favor and obligation that determine how decisions are actually made versus how they are supposed to be made according to official procedures. Pay particular attention to the gap between what people say they value and what their actions reveal they actually prioritize. This understanding will guide your approach to every subsequent interaction. The colleague who claims to make decisions based on data may actually be more influenced by personal relationships. The manager who preaches teamwork may respond better to appeals that emphasize individual recognition. Start practicing these techniques in low-stakes situations where mistakes will not carry serious consequences. Offer genuine assistance to colleagues without immediate expectation of return. Then observe how those investments create goodwill over time. Practice timing your suggestions to coincide with moments when others are most receptive. Experiment with presenting ideas as questions rather than statements and notice how this changes the reception you receive. Develop your reputation deliberately by ensuring that your actions consistently reinforce the perception you want others to have of your character and capabilities. Choose a few key qualities, perhaps reliability, insight, or discretion, and make every decision with those reputation goals in mind. Remember that reputation compounds over time, but it also requires constant protection through consistent behavior. Learn to recognize your own psychological patterns and emotional triggers, so they do not undermine your effectiveness. The person who loses composure under pressure, who takes disagreement personally, or who becomes defensive when questioned cannot maintain the strategic thinking the sophisticated influence requires. Self-awareness becomes your foundation for understanding and guiding others. Practice reading the unspoken communications that accompany every interaction. Notice changes in body language that indicate comfort or discomfort with different topics. Learn to recognize when someone is telling you what they think you want to hear versus when they are sharing their genuine thoughts. These observational skills will guide your approach to each relationship and conversation. Build your network gradually and authentically by focusing on how you can provide value to others, rather than on what you hope to gain from them. The most powerful networks develop organically around mutual benefit rather than calculated manipulation. Seek opportunities to connect people who could help each other, to share information that others find useful, and to solve problems that create lasting gratitude. Master the art of patience by learning to plant seeds without demanding immediate harvest. Some of the most powerful influence techniques require months or years to mature fully. The relationship you build today may become crucial to a challenge you have not yet encountered. The reputation you develop through small, consistent actions may open opportunities you cannot currently imagine. As you develop these skills, maintain constant awareness of the ethical dimensions of your growing influence. Regular reflection on whether your actions serve broader interests beyond your immediate self-interest will prevent the gradual corruption that can accompany increasing power. The techniques themselves are neutral. Their moral value depends entirely on the purposes for which you employ them. Expect resistance, both from others and from yourself, as you begin applying these principles. People may notice changes in your approach and question your motivations. You may feel uncomfortable with strategic thinking that contradicts the naive assumptions about influence that most people prefer to maintain. This discomfort is normal and indicates that you are developing capabilities that set you apart from those who never progress beyond accidental influence. Learn from every interaction by maintaining a private practice of analyzing what worked, what failed, and why. Notice which approaches generate cooperation versus resistance with different personality types. Pay attention to how timing affects the reception your ideas receive. Study how small changes in your presentation dramatically alter the outcomes you achieve. Remember that true mastery of influence serves not only your own advancement, but also your ability to protect yourself and others from those who would use these same techniques for harmful purposes. The person who understands how manipulation works becomes much more difficult to manipulate. The leader who recognizes the patterns of influence can guide their organization more effectively toward beneficial outcomes. The scroll represents the continuity of knowledge that passes from one generation to the next, evolving with each application while maintaining its essential insights into the eternal patterns of human nature. You now possess understanding that can transform your effectiveness in every relationship and endeavor. but only if you have the wisdom to use it responsibly and the patience to develop it skillfully. The eternal flame burns in my study as a reminder that the games of power and influence continue long after individual players exit the stage. What I have shared with you represents not my personal invention, but my observations of patterns that have shaped human relationships since the first. Communities formed around shared interests and competing ambitions. These dynamics will persist as long as people must cooperate to achieve goals while maintaining their individual desires for security, recognition, and advantage. 500 years have passed since I walked the halls of Florentine power, yet the fundamental challenges remain unchanged. People still struggle to balance personal ambition with collective responsibility. Leaders still must choose between idealistic principles and practical necessities. Individuals still must navigate complex social environments where success depends as much on understanding others as on developing their own capabilities. The eternal flame illuminates a profound truth. These are not temporary problems that future progress will solve, but permanent features of the human condition that each generation must learn to manage anew. Technology will continue evolving, political systems will transform, economic structures will adapt, but the psychology that drives human behavior will remain remarkably consistent across centuries and cultures. This continuity means that the insights I have shared retain their relevance regardless of how dramatically the surface conditions of life may change. The person who masters these principles gains access to understanding that transcends any particular era or context. They learn to see through the temporary manifestations of power to the eternal patterns that determine how influence actually flows between people. Yet with this understanding comes profound responsibility. Knowledge of how to shape others' decisions and guide their behavior must be tempered by wisdom about when and why such influence should be exercised. The techniques themselves are morally neutral tools that become beneficial or harmful depending on the intentions and character of those who employ them. I've observed that power gravitates naturally toward those who understand its dynamics, regardless of whether they use that understanding ethically. This creates an obligation for those who would use influence responsibly to develop their capabilities fully rather than ceding the field to those who have no such moral constraints. In a world where manipulation is inevitable, conscious and ethical influence becomes a form of protection for everyone who might otherwise become victim to less scrupulous practitioners. The eternal game also means that your mastery of these principles is never complete. Each new relationship, each changed circumstance, each generation of colleagues requires fresh application of timeless insights. The techniques must be adapted to new technologies, different cultures, evolving social norms, and the unique personalities of the individuals you encounter. Static approaches become ineffective as conditions change around them. This need for constant adaptation makes influence an art rather than a science. While the underlying principles remain stable, their successful application requires creativity, intuition, and sensitivity to subtle variations in context and personality. The master practitioner develops judgment that goes beyond mechanical application of techniques to genuine understanding of how to serve human flourishing while achieving necessary results. As I prepare to leave you with these insights, I am struck by how the flame's light reveals both shadows and illumination. The same knowledge that can help you protect yourself and serve others can also enable exploitation and manipulation if misused. The choice between these applications lies entirely within your character and your commitment to purposes larger than immediate self-interest. The eternal flame reminds me that influence is not something you possess, but something you participate in. Every interaction contributes to the larger web of relationships that shapes outcomes for countless others. When you choose to use these principles ethically, you strengthen the possibility that influence will flow toward beneficial ends. When others observe your success achieved through responsible application of these techniques, they learn that effectiveness and morality can be combined rather than sacrificed to each other. Your journey with this knowledge will likely follow predictable stages. Initially, you may feel overwhelmed by the complexity of reading social dynamics, while simultaneously managing your own responses and planning strategic approaches. This is normal. Mastery develops gradually through practice and reflection. Trust that your skills will improve as you apply these principles consistently over time. You may also experience moments of discomfort as you recognize how much unconscious influence already surrounds you. Once you understand these dynamics, you cannot return to naive assumptions about how decisions are made or relationships develop. This awareness is the price of sophisticated understanding, but it provides protection that ignorance cannot offer. Eventually, these approaches will become natural extensions of your authentic personality rather than techniques you consciously apply. The most masterful practitioners integrate strategic thinking so completely into their character that they influence others effortlessly while remaining true to their fundamental values. This integration represents the highest achievement in the art of ethical influence. Remember that the ultimate test of your mastery lies not in your ability to control others, but in your wisdom about when to exercise influence and when to refrain from it. The person who understands power deeply enough to use it responsibly often finds that restraint becomes their greatest source of strength. People trust those who possess capabilities they do not abuse. The eternal game continues, regardless of whether you choose to play it consciously. Others around you will continue using influence techniques whether they understand them explicitly or apply them intuitively. Your choice is whether to develop your own understanding and skill, or to remain vulnerable to their applications while limiting your own effectiveness in serving the causes and people you care about. I leave you with this final reflection. The principles I have shared represent not cynical manipulation of human nature, but deep respect for its complexities and contradictions. People are simultaneously noble and selfish, rational and emotional, generous and calculating. Effective influence honors this duality by working with human psychology as it actually exists rather than as we might wish it to be. The eternal flame will continue burning long after our conversation ends, illuminating the timeless patterns that connect my Renaissance Florence to your contemporary world. The techniques I learned in the corridors of power 5 centuries ago await your adaptation to the challenges and opportunities of your own era. Use this knowledge wisely, and it will serve you well throughout whatever games of influence await you in the years ahead.